A young beggar girl with terminal cancer made an unexpected request to a millionaire. His answer was shocking, and what happened next will deeply move you. The apartment was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, that lingered in the air long after the heater had given up for the night. Jessica pulled her sweater tighter around her shoulders as she stirred the pot of oatmeal. It was thin, watery, stretched beyond what it should be, but it was all they had left. Behind her, Lily sat by the window, knees tucked to her chest. The glass was cracked in one corner, a web of thin lines spreading across it like veins. Beyond it, the city pulsed, bright, busy, full of people rushing from one place to another. None of them knew about the small girl sitting in the dim light of a rundown apartment, watching, waiting, wondering. Jessica turned from the stove, a weary smile forced onto her face. "Breakfast is ready, sweetheart." Lily didn't move at first. Her fingers traced a half-drawn princess in her notebook, the pencil hovering just above the page. Her princesses never had faces. She wasn't sure why, maybe because she didn't know what happiness looked like anymore. She finally turned, her movements slow, careful. Even at 6 years old, she carried herself like someone much older, someone who understood more than she should. Jessica placed the bowl in front of her, sitting across the small, wobbly table. She watched as Lily lifted the spoon, stirring the oatmeal absent-mindedly. "It's a little thin today," Jessica admitted, forcing out a chuckle. "But it still counts as breakfast." Lily took a small bite, nodding, but said nothing. Jessica hesitated before speaking again. "How are you feeling?" "Good," Lily answered too quickly. Jessica's eyes flicked to the faint flush on her daughter's cheeks, the way her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the spoon. She was not good. But what could she say? The hospital had already called. The next treatment wouldn't happen unless they made a payment, and Jessica had nothing left. She worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices until her hands were raw, and then serving coffee at a diner, her feet aching by the time she stumbled home. But it was never enough. The hospital bills, the medications, the rent that was already 2 weeks late. Every dollar disappeared before she could even hold on to it. She forced herself to smile. "After breakfast, maybe we can go for a little walk. You'd like that, wouldn't you?" Lily nodded again but didn't look up. Later that morning, as Jessica washed their 2 bowls in the tiny sink, Lily went back to the window. Her legs dangled from the chair, too short to reach the floor. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass, watching the world outside. A woman in a fur coat walked briskly, holding a paper cup of coffee, steam curling into the air. A man in a sharp suit spoke into a phone, his voice lost in the city noise. Couples strolled, laughing, wrapped in warm scarves. She wondered what it was like to wake up in a house that didn't smell like damp walls and expired food, to not be cold all the time. Her fingers absent-mindedly ran over her bald scalp. She missed her hair, the way it used to fall over her shoulders like her mother's. Now, kids at the shelter whispered behind her back, "She looks like a doll without hair, like a little alien." She never let Jessica see her cry. Instead, she smiled, like she was doing now. "Mom?" she asked softly. Jessica turned, drying her hands on a thin towel. "Yeah, sweetheart?" Lily hesitated before speaking. "Do you think I'd look pretty in a white dress?" Jessica's hands stilled. "What do you mean?" "A wedding dress," Lily clarified. "Like the ones in the magazines." Jessica frowned, wiping her hands slower now. "Where did that come from?" Lily shrugged. "I found a picture." Jessica walked over, crouching beside her. "Sweetheart, you don't have to think about things like that. You have plenty of time to—" "But I want to," Lily interrupted. Jessica studied her daughter's face, the way her lips pressed together, the quiet determination in her tired eyes. A lump formed in her throat. "We'll find you a dress someday," Jessica whispered. Lily's lips curled up in the smallest of smiles, but she didn't say anything else. That night, when Jessica thought she was asleep, Lily crawled out of bed and fished out the crumpled magazine page from her pocket. The bride in the photo was beautiful. She had soft, golden curls that framed her face, her veil shimmering like morning light through the window. Her dress flowed around her, perfect and weightless, like something out of a dream. Lily traced the lines of the dress, the delicate folds and tiny pearl buttons running down the bride's back. She wondered what it felt like to wear something so pure, so magical. Would she ever feel like that? Would she ever wear a dress like this? A quiet sigh escaped her lips. She knew the answer. Princesses in stories got weddings. Little girls like her, sick, small, fading, did not. She carefully folded the page and tucked it under her pillow, pressing it down as if she could hold the dream in place, make it stay. If I only had one wish left, she thought, her fingers tightening around the pillow's edge. I know what it would be, but wishes needed miracles, and miracles didn't come to girls like her. She closed her eyes. The room was still cold. The next morning, the morning air was sharp, cutting through the layers of Jessica's worn-out coat as she stepped onto the cracked sidewalk. The city moved around her in a blur. People in long coats rushing past with coffee cups in hand, taxis honking, the constant hum of life pressing forward. No one noticed her. No one noticed Lily. Jessica pulled Lily's small hand into hers, squeezing gently. The fever hadn't broken. She could feel the heat radiating from her daughter's palm, the way her fingers trembled slightly in the cold. The hospital had called again that morning. "Miss Bennett, we need to discuss your daughter's treatment plan. Without the next payment, we'll have to put her sessions on hold." Jessica had tried explaining, tried pleading, but the voice on the other end had stayed firm, detached. Bills were bills, and they didn't wait. Now she was here, a last resort. She took a deep breath and stepped into the small convenience store where she knew she might find an old friend, Marianne, a woman she used to work with before everything fell apart. Jessica spotted her behind the counter, ringing up a customer. Marianne looked up, her eyes widening for a split second before she forced a smile. "Jess, wow, it's been a while." Jessica nodded. "Yeah, it has." There was an awkward pause. Lily shifted beside her, pulling her hoodie over her head, trying to block out the too bright fluorescent lights. Jessica hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Look, Marianne, I wouldn't ask if I had another choice. But Lily's sick. I just need a little to get through this month." Marianne's smile faltered. She glanced at the register, then back at Jessica. "Jess, I wish I could help, I do, but you know how things are. My hours got cut, and I'm barely scraping by myself." Jessica swallowed the lump in her throat. Marianne sighed, leaning in. "Have you tried a church, a shelter?" Jessica forced a nod. "Yeah, it was a lie. She hadn't gone yet. Not because she didn't need help, God she did, but because asking a stranger for charity felt like losing another piece of herself." Marianne's fingers drummed against the counter. "I'm sorry," she murmured. Jessica exhaled slowly. "Yeah, me too." She turned, taking Lily's hand once more. They stepped back into the grey, restless world of the city, blending into the crowd. No one looked twice. The pharmacy was quiet when they arrived, but the fluorescent lights flickered, buzzing faintly. Jessica approached the counter, her hands gripping the edge like a lifeline. The pharmacist, a man in his 50s with tired eyes, recognized her. She had been here before, too many times. She slid the prescription across the counter. "I know I still owe you from last time," she said, keeping her voice steady. "But she needs this. Can I pay later?" The man picked up the paper, scanning it briefly before shaking his head. "I'm sorry, Jess, I can't do it. I've already let too many tabs run unpaid." Jessica felt her stomach drop. "Please, I just need a few more days." "I wish I could," he said, and for a second his expression softened. But then his gaze flickered to the security camera in the corner, and his jaw tightened. "But I can't." Jessica stared at him, then at the small bag of medicine just behind the counter, so close she could reach for it if she wanted to. She turned to Lily, who stood silent, watching. Jessica forced herself to step back. "Okay," she murmured. She guided Lily out the door. The cold hit them again, sharper now, crueler. Lily didn't say anything at first. She just hugged herself, her hoodie barely enough to block out the chill. Then, her voice small, uncertain, broke the silence. "Mum? Is it bad if I don't take the medicine?" Jessica's heart clenched. "Don't think about that, sweetheart." Lily nodded, her breath curling in the cold air. They walked without speaking, Jessica's mind racing. She had no more options, and then Lily stopped. Her small hand pulled against Jessica's, making her pause. "Mom?" Lily whispered, eyes locked on something across the street. Jessica followed her gaze. There, standing by the stone fountain in the park, was a man. His coat was expensive, his shoes polished. He had the look of someone who had never missed a meal, never had to count crumpled bills and decide between rent or medicine. But there was something off about him. He wasn't moving. He just stood there, staring at the water, lost in thought, like he didn't belong in the rush of people around him. Lily squeezed Jessica's hand. "He looks like a prince." Jessica sighed, rubbing her temple. "Come on, honey, let's get home." But as they walked away, Lily kept glancing back at the man in the perfectly tailored suit, who stood alone in a city too busy to notice. She let go of her mother's hand. Jessica didn't notice at first. She was busy adjusting Lily's hood, making sure the cold air wouldn't bite too hard at her pale skin. By the time she turned back, Lily was already slipping through the crowd, her small frame darting past people too busy to care. "Lily!" Jessica's voice was sharp, urgent, but Lily kept going. She stopped right in front of him, the man in the expensive coat, the one who didn't belong here but somehow seemed trapped in the same city she was. Ethan Carter looked down, and for the first time in a long time he was surprised. He had spent years in boardrooms where nothing shocked him anymore. He had been in meetings where billions were discussed like spare change, where deals were made with nothing but firm handshakes and colder smiles. He had built a life where everything was predictable, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of the frail, bald-headed girl staring up at him with wide, knowing eyes, and then she spoke. "Mr. Prince," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, "do you want to marry me?" The words hung in the air, absurd and weightless, like the first flakes of snow before a storm. Ethan blinked. Of all the things he had expected today, another meaningless investor call, a dinner reservation, he wasn't looking forward to. This was not one of them. He crouched slightly, lowering himself to her level. "Why do you want to marry me, kid?" Lily tilted her head, her lips curving into the smallest knowing smile. "Because every princess needs a prince," she said matter-of-factly. Then her voice dropped into something softer, more certain. "And I want to be a bride before I go to heaven." Ethan felt something in his chest tighten. It wasn't the words themselves, it was the way she said them, with a certainty that children shouldn't have, the kind of certainty that only came when you had already accepted something that the rest of the world hadn't. Jessica was suddenly there, grabbing Lily's hand, pulling her back. "I'm so sorry," she said quickly, her voice breathless. "She doesn't know what she's saying." Lily's grip tightened around the fabric of her mother's sleeve. "Yes, I do." Jessica's face was red, her eyes darting between her daughter and the man in front of them. She was embarrassed, desperate to get away. She knew better than to linger in places where they didn't belong. "I shouldn't have let go of her hand," she muttered, her fingers curling around Lily's wrist. "We'll get out of your way." Ethan hadn't meant to say it. Jessica stopped. Lily did too. Ethan didn't know what he was doing or why, but the words were already out there, irreversible. He looked at Lily again, at the way she stood straight, despite how fragile she looked. There was something about her that felt too big for her tiny body, too heavy for her small hands to hold, and he realized it had been a long time since anyone had asked him for anything that wasn't money. Jessica shifted, uncomfortable under his gaze. "Sorry, she's just a kid. She doesn't understand what she's saying." "I know," Ethan interrupted. His voice was steady, thoughtful. He turned his attention back to Lily. "But you don't talk like most kids." Lily's lips curled upward again. It wasn't a real smile, but it was close. "I'm not most kids." Ethan exhaled through his nose, something almost like amusement flickering in his eyes. "I can see that." Jessica, still tense, pulled Lily a little closer. "We should really go." Lily's fingers tightened around the edge of her coat. She wasn't ready to leave, not yet, but her mother was. Jessica nodded stiffly, murmured another apology, then turned away. Lily glanced back one last time. Ethan was still looking at her. She gave him one last smile, the kind that held secrets, the kind that felt like it belonged to someone much older. And then she disappeared into the city crowd. But something about her lingered. Ethan didn't move for a long time. The city continued around him, indifferent and restless. The fountain water rippled, taxis rushed by, people walked past without a glance. but all he could hear was her voice. "I want to be a bride before I go to heaven." He shook his head, adjusting the cuffs of his sleeve. She was just a kid, a stranger. Ethan stepped toward the sleek black SUV, its tinted windows reflecting the restless blur of the city. The driver stood at attention, pulling the door open, but Ethan hesitated for just a moment, just long enough to glance back at the fountain. She was gone. The crowd had swallowed her up, just like it always did in this city. People came and went. Lives brushed past each other like ghosts, forgotten the moment they disappeared into the rush of moving bodies. But not her. Lily's voice still clung to the air, fragile but unwavering. "Will you marry me?" "Before I go to heaven." Ethan exhaled, shaking his head as he climbed into the car. The door shut behind him with a soft thud, sealing him inside a world far removed from the one he had just walked through. The city blurred past as the car pulled away, neon reflections streaking across the windows. He loosened his tie, leaning back into the leather seat, but the silence pressed against his chest in a way that felt heavier than usual. He didn't want to think about her. But he did. The elevator doors slid open to reveal the sprawling penthouse that towered over the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the walls, offering a view of New York in all its cold, shimmering beauty. Everything inside was sleek, pristine, hand-picked by interior designers he had never met. The furniture was expensive, the artwork on the walls worth more than most people's homes. Even the air smelled rich, like leather and aged whiskey, and yet it all felt hollow. Ethan tossed his coat over the back of the couch, loosening the top button of his shirt as he made his way to the bar. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, top shelf, imported, aged longer than Lily had been alive. He lifted the glass, but before he could take a sip, he saw her again. Not in the room, not in the city lights below, but in the space between his thoughts. That tiny frame, the too big hoodie hanging off her shoulders, the pale skin that shouldn't have held so much life, and the way she smiled like she knew something the rest of the world didn't. He closed his eyes. He needed to stop thinking about her. But the harder he tried, the louder her voice became. "Every princess needs a prince before I go to heaven." His fingers tightened around the glass. He downed the drink in one gulp. The warmth spread through his chest, but it did nothing to chase away the cold pressing at his ribs. Ethan had spent years making sure he never felt things too deeply. It was easier that way. Feelings led to pain, attachment led to loss, and he had learned at a very young age that people didn't always stay. He was 8 when he lost his parents. One moment they were there, his father's deep laughter filling the study, his mother's perfume lingering in the air like something warm and safe, and then they were gone. A car crash, a single phone call. His world had ended in a moment. The funeral was filled with people in dark suits and false sympathies, murmuring things like, "Such a tragedy," and "He'll be well taken care of." But no one meant it. He had been passed around like an inconvenience, a burden too heavy for anyone to carry for long. His relatives, vultures in expensive clothing, hadn't seen a grieving child. They had seen a future inheritance, and so he had learned. He learned that love was conditional, that kindness always came with a price. He learned that money was the only thing people truly respected. So he built himself into a man no one could pity, no one could touch. And it worked, at least until today, because now, for the first time in as long as he could remember, something had gotten past the walls. Not something, someone. A 6-year-old girl with 2 big eyes and a question that wouldn't leave him alone. "Will you marry me?" He poured another drink, but all he could hear was her voice. "Before I go to heaven." Ethan set the glass down, his fingers lingering against the smooth surface of the counter. He didn't know this girl. She was a stranger, a passing moment. In a week, she'd be forgotten like everything else. That's how life worked. His chest ached in a way it hadn't in years. He looked back at the whiskey, but he already knew this wasn't something he could drink away. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the hardwood floor as he stalked toward the window. The city sprawled below him, endless, indifferent. Millions of people moving, chasing, surviving. And somewhere down there, in a place he couldn't even picture, A little girl was fighting a battle she wasn't supposed to fight alone. Why did it matter to him? It shouldn't. It didn't. He had told himself that 3 times already, but his hands were already moving, reaching for his phone before he could think better of it. A few keystrokes. Please investigate the mother and son I met today. Please investigate the mother and son I met today. Click send and put the phone down. He didn't know what he expected. Maybe an address, a few lines about a struggling single mother, maybe something that would make it easier to put this whole thing behind him. The next day, Ethan sat at his desk, fingers tapping lightly against the polished wood. The city stretched out beyond the towering windows, but his eyes weren't on the skyline, they were fixed on the paperwork in front of him. A single address, a medical report, a balance statement showing months of unpaid hospital bills. He had told himself he wouldn't look. He had told himself she was just a girl, a fleeting moment in a day filled with bigger things. But here he was. The name on the file was Jessica Bennett, a single mother with no listed employer, no stable income, and a daughter, Lily Bennett, 6 years old, battling an aggressive illness that would not wait for charity or good intentions. Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He had built his life on logic, precision, control. But this wasn't logical. There was no strategy in what he was about to do, and yet he couldn't stop himself. He picked up his phone. "Find them," he said. The building looked worse in person than it had on paper. Ethan stood at the curb, staring up at the grey, crumbling exterior, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. The entrance smelled like damp concrete and stale cigarettes, the kind of place that suffocated dreams before they could form. A rusted intercom panel blinked with missing buttons. For a moment he hesitated. This wasn't his world. He could still turn around, get back into his car, forget about the girl with big eyes and a voice that wouldn't leave him alone. But then he heard it. A harsh, ragged cough. Not from inside the building, from the alley beside it. Ethan turned the corner, and there she was. Jessica sat on an old milk crate, rubbing Lily's back as the little girl hunched forward, her small frame trembling. Her thin hoodie did nothing against the cold. "Breathe, baby," Jessica murmured, her voice gentle but strained. Lily gasped between coughs, her hands gripping the fabric of her mother's sleeve. Ethan didn't think. He moved. "You need to get her inside," he said, stepping forward. Jessica jerked her head up, eyes narrowing. She recognized him. Lily lifted her head too, blinking through the feverish haze. "Mr. Prince," she rasped. Ethan crouched in front of her, ignoring Jessica's guarded posture. "You don't sound too good, Princess." Lily gave him a weak smile. "Still better than yesterday?" Jessica stood, pulling Lily closer. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was tight, defensive. Ethan met her gaze, steady and unwavering. "I came to help." Jessica shook her head immediately. "No, you don't even know what I'm offering." "I don't have to," Ethan straightened. "I can pay for her treatment." Jessica's shoulders went rigid. Lily went still. "I can make sure she gets what she needs. The best care, the best doctors. No more waiting, no more overdue notices, just treatment." Jessica's hands curled into fists at her sides. "I don't take charity." "This isn't charity." Jessica let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Then what is it?" Ethan hesitated. He hadn't figured that part out yet. "I don't want to owe you," she said, voice low. "Because people like you, men in suits, men with money, you always come collecting." Ethan took a slow breath, choosing his next words carefully. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "Except maybe letting your daughter live." Jessica flinched. Lily coughed again, this time worse. Her knees buckled, her body trembling as she leaned into her mother. Jessica caught her, holding her close, panic flashing in her eyes. Ethan didn't move. He just waited. Jessica swallowed hard, looking at her daughter, at the fragile body, the too warm skin, the way her breath rattled in her chest. Then, without looking at Ethan, she whispered, "What's the catch?" "No catch," he said softly. "Just let me help her." Jessica closed her eyes. Lily, still weak in her mother's arms, lifted her head and smiled. "I told you he was a prince." Ethan knelt beside Lily, watching as her small chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. Her skin was too warm, her eyelids fluttering as she tried to stay awake. She was slipping, and every second counted. He turned to Jessica. "We need to get her to the hospital, now." Jessica hesitated, her arms tightening protectively around her daughter. Her pride had held firm before, but this was different. Lily wasn't just sick, she was fading. She swallowed hard, looking at Ethan, then at Lily's too pale face. "Okay," she whispered. That was all Ethan needed. He scooped Lily into his arms, lifting her with ease. She barely stirred, her small body pressing against his chest. For someone who had built an empire out of sheer force and control, he had never felt something so delicate, so breakable in his hands before. "Hang on, princess," he murmured. "You're not done fighting yet." The black SUV peeled away from the curb, slicing through the city streets. Jessica sat beside him, one hand on Lily's arm, the other clenched into a fist in her lap. The world outside blurred, streetlights flashing by in streaks of gold and red. Ethan barely noticed. He just kept looking at Lily. She was too quiet, too still. He had seen this before in boardrooms, in men who had lost everything. That moment when the fight started slipping from their eyes. He wasn't going to let that happen to her. The hospital doors burst open the moment they arrived. A team of doctors and nurses were already waiting, because Ethan Carter didn't wait in lines, didn't take no for an answer. Jessica clutched Lily's hand as they wheeled her in, her face tight with fear. She didn't have to ask how Ethan had done this, she just knew. Ethan followed, his jaw set. "Whatever she needs," he told the doctor in charge. "Do it. Money isn't an issue." They nodded, rushing Lily away, and just like that she was gone, behind closed doors. Jessica sank into a chair in the waiting area, hands shaking in her lap. She looked lost, a mother who had spent too long fighting alone. Ethan sat beside her, silent. He wasn't used to just sitting, just waiting. Hours passed. Doctors came and went, tests, procedures, a flurry of movement behind glass doors. Finally, a doctor approached. "We've stabilized her," she said. "We'll do everything we can to keep her comfortable, but the truth is, the illness has progressed too far." Jessica exhaled sharply like she'd been punched in the stomach. Ethan's expression didn't change, but his fingers curled into fists. "There's nothing we can do?" he asked, his voice dangerously even. The doctor hesitated. "We can buy her time, weeks, maybe months, but not forever." Jessica pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes filling with helpless, exhausted grief. Ethan just nodded. He had faced many losses in his life, but none of them had felt like this. He turned toward the glass window where Lily lay in the hospital bed, her small hands curled against the sheets. She had asked him to marry her. She had spoken about heaven like it was inevitable. But for the first time since he met her, Ethan realized he wasn't ready to let her go. The days passed. Lily grew stronger in some ways, weaker in others. The treatments helped, but they couldn't fix what was already broken. Still, she smiled when Ethan walked in. She called him Prince Ethan now, her voice full of something too close to trust. Jessica watched them carefully, the way Ethan softened in ways she doubted he even noticed, the way Lily's laughter pulled something out of him, something human, something real. One night, as Lily slept, Ethan spoke the words out loud before he could stop himself. "I want to give her what she asked for." Jessica turned to him, confused. "What?" Ethan's gaze never left Lily's sleeping form. "She wants to be a bride. She wants to feel like a princess before—" He didn't finish the sentence. But Jessica understood. She swallowed. "Ethan, that's crazy?" he finished. He let out a quiet laugh. "Yeah, it is." Jessica shook her head. "No, not crazy, just impossible. Not for me." Jessica sighed, rubbing her forehead. "You can't just throw money at this and fix it." "I'm not trying to fix it." Ethan turned to her then, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes that startled her. Determination, not the kind that came from business deals or stock markets. Something deeper, something desperate. "I can't save her, Jessica," he said, his voice steady but low, almost broken. "But I can give her this." Jessica hesitated, her hands gripping the arms of the chair. She had spent her whole life refusing help, refusing pity. But this wasn't charity. This was a gift. She exhaled. "What are you planning?" Ethan leaned back, a plan already forming in his mind. The dress, the flowers, a ballroom, a fairy tale. Jessica let out something between a laugh and a sob. "A wedding?" she whispered. Ethan nodded once. "A real one." Jessica looked at Lily again. Her small hands curled against the hospital blankets, her tiny chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. For once, Jessica didn't think about what was practical or what was realistic. She thought about what Lily deserved. Slowly, she nodded. "Okay." The changes in Ethan's estate took place almost within days. No one questioned the request. When Ethan Carter said something needed to be done, it happened. No delays, no complications. And so the mansion became a fairy tale. Soft golden lights draped across the grand hall, casting a warm glow over the chandeliers. Hundreds of fresh flowers filled the space, their scent lingering in the air like something out of a dream. A gentle melody played in the background, not the stiff, formal music of society events, but something light, whimsical, something a little girl would love. The staff moved quickly, setting up rows of delicate white chairs, preparing a small altar beneath a floral arch, draping silk ribbons over every possible surface. Everything had to be perfect, because this wasn't just a party, this was a promise. Lily sat on a velvet stool in front of a grand mirror, staring at the dress. It was perfect. White satin, soft and flowing, just like the one in the magazine page she had hidden beneath her pillow. Jessica stood behind her, hands resting gently on Lily's frail shoulders. She had resisted at first. This whole thing had felt too much, too big, too unreal. But now, standing here, watching her daughter's pure, quiet joy, she couldn't deny it anymore. This wasn't about money. This wasn't about pity. This was about a little girl who had fought harder than anyone should ever have to fight. Lily reached out, brushing her small fingers against the delicate lace. "It's real," she whispered. Jessica blinked back tears. "It's real, sweetheart." Lily turned, looking up at her mother. "Do you think I look like a princess?" Jessica let out a shaky breath. "You look like the most beautiful princess in the world," Lily beamed. As guests took their seats in the candlelit ballroom, Ethan stood near the altar, adjusting the cuff of his suit. He wasn't nervous. Business deals, boardrooms, high-stakes negotiations, those had never rattled him. But this was the most important thing he had ever done. And then the doors opened. Jessica stepped in first, elegant in a simple navy dress, her eyes glistening. And beside Lily. She took slow, careful steps, her small frame wrapped in layers of soft white fabric. The veil shimmered in the light, her tiny hands gripping a bouquet of baby's breath. She was beautiful, and for the first time, Ethan saw nothing but joy in her eyes. He felt something tighten in his chest. This moment, this little girl, she had no idea what she had done to him. Ethel knelt as Lily reached him, their eyes meeting. "You made it, Princess," he said softly. Lily giggled, covering her mouth. Of course, every bride has to be on time. A quiet chuckle rippled through the small crowd. Ethan reached into his pocket, pulling out a tiny, delicate ring. It wasn't extravagant, just a simple silver band, small enough to fit around her frail finger. He took her hand gently. "You will always be a princess, Lily," he whispered. Lily watched as the ring slid onto her finger, her eyes wide. She looked at Ethan, her expression a mixture of awe and something deeper, something only she understood. And then she whispered back, "Even in heaven?" Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat. He forced a small smile, squeezing her hand lightly. "Especially in heaven." Later that night, as the guests mingled, Ethan watched Lily twirl in the center of the ballroom. Her small frame swayed with the music, the layers of her dress spinning around her. She looked weightless, like she had no illness, no pain, like she was just a little girl living her dream. Jessica stood beside Ethan, watching. "She's happy," she murmured. Ethan nodded. "She deserves to be." Jessica turned to him then, studying him. "Why did you do this?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He had asked himself the same question 100 times. But now, watching Lily laugh as she danced, he finally knew. "Because I could." Jessica's eyes softened. She understood. They watched as Lily ran toward Ethan, reaching for his hand. "Prince Ethan, we never had our dance." He chuckled. "You're right, that was terribly rude of me." Knelt, lifting her gently into his arms. The music slowed, and he rocked her lightly, her small hands gripping his collar as she rested her head against his shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered. He closed his eyes. "Anything for you, princess." After the wedding, Lily's strength faded faster than anyone expected. The doctors had warned them. They had said the treatments would only buy time, not a cure. But for a while it had been easy to pretend, to believe that maybe, somehow, she had more time than they thought. But illness doesn't wait, and now it was taking her. The hospital room was dim, the soft glow of a bedside lamp casting shadows against the walls. Outside, the city continued, cars, voices, lights flickering across the skyline. But inside there was only quiet. Ethan sat on one side of the bed, Jessica on the other, and in the middle of them was Lily. Her breaths were shallower now, her small body curled under the soft blankets Ethan had brought from his home. Not the stiff hospital sheets, but something warm, something comforting. She was weak, but she was awake. Her fingers, thin and delicate, reached for Ethan's hand first. He took it immediately, his larger hands dwarfing hers, but he held her gently, as if afraid she might slip away too fast. She turned her head slightly, looking at Jessica. Jessica leaned closer, stroking Lily's forehead, brushing away the damp strands of hair sticking to her skin. "Mom?" Jessica swallowed the lump in her throat. "I'm here, baby." Lily smiled faintly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you happy?" Jessica's breath hitched. "I will be," she promised, "because you made me the luckiest mom in the world." Lily's fingers curled slightly against Ethan's palm. "Prince Ethan?" His throat was tight. He wasn't sure if he could speak, but he forced himself to find the words. "Yeah, princess?" Lily's tired eyes softened. "Will you keep taking care of Mom?" Ethan's chest ached in a way he wasn't ready for. She wasn't asking. She was giving him something. She was leaving Jessica with him. A final wish, a final gift. His voice was hoarse when he answered, "I promise." Lily exhaled, a long, slow sigh. She smiled. "Then I'm not scared." She squeezed their hands, both of them. "Stay together," she whispered. Then, with one last content breath, she was gone. Jessica let out a quiet sob, pressing her forehead against Lily's hand. Ethan stayed still. He had been to funerals. He had watched people die in cold, clinical settings, watched men break under the weight of their failures, but nothing had ever felt like this. Nothing had ever felt so final, so unfair, but at the same time, so peaceful. Because Lily hadn't been afraid. She had left knowing she was loved. The hospital room felt too quiet. Jessica's shoulders shook as she held onto Lily's hand, unwilling to let go. Ethan looked down at the small girl who had changed everything, and something inside him cracked. For years he had built a life designed to keep people out. He had made sure he would never be vulnerable, never need anyone, never feel the sting of loss again. But Lily? She had walked straight through those walls. She had left a mark on him that would never fade. Jessica lifted her head, her eyes red and swollen. Her pain was a reflection of his own, and for the first time in years, Ethan didn't push it away. He just reached for her. Jessica hesitated only a moment before leaning into him. Not as a business deal, not as an obligation, but as two people who had just lost something irreplaceable. Ethan wrapped an arm around her, his grip firm, steady. "I don't know how to do this," Jessica whispered. Ethan's voice was quiet. "Neither do I." But they had promise, and promises weren't meant to be broken. Ethan had spent his life avoiding loss. He had built walls, high, impenetrable, reinforced with success, power, and wealth. No one had ever gotten close enough to truly hurt him. But now, for the first time, he understood what it meant to lose something that mattered. Lily was gone, and no amount of money, no business deal, no carefully calculated strategy could bring her back. Jessica had barely spoken since the funeral. She moved like a ghost, drifting through the motions of the day, barely eating, barely sleeping. Ethan stayed close. He didn't know how to comfort her, but he knew what it felt like to be alone in grief. He wouldn't let her go through this alone, and yet He couldn't shake the feeling that Lily deserved more than just sadness. She had lived with joy. She had smiled even when the world had given her nothing to smile about. She had never been afraid. Ethan refused to let her memory fade into just another tragedy. She deserved a legacy. A week after the funeral, Ethan called a meeting. Not with board members, not with investors, but with the people who could help him make something real. When Jessica arrived at his penthouse that evening, she looked exhausted, dark circles beneath her red-rimmed eyes. "You didn't tell me what this was about," she said softly, taking a seat on the couch. Ethan sat across from her, his fingers interlaced. For the first time in his life, he hesitated before speaking. "I want to start something," he finally said. Jessica frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" He exhaled. "Lily wanted to be a princess. She wanted a fairy tale, and we gave her that. But there are other kids like her, kids who don't get miracles, who don't get second chances." Jessica's breath hitched, but she didn't speak. Ethan leaned forward. "I want to create something in her name, the Princess Lily Foundation, a place where kids like her, kids fighting impossible battles, have a chance." Jessica's fingers curled into her sweater. "A charity?" "A mission." Ethan's voice was firm. This wasn't about guilt. It wasn't about making himself feel better. It was about Lily. Jessica swallowed hard. "I don't know if I can." "You can." Ethan's voice was quieter now, "because Lily would want you to." Jessica's shoulders trembled. She turned away, eyes glistening. "She's gone, Ethan." Ethan nodded. "I know." Jessica wiped at her face, inhaling shakily. "Then let's make sure she's never forgotten." The following weeks were filled with movement. For the first time since Lily's death, Jessica had purpose again. She met with doctors, hospital administrators, and parents who had lived through the same nightmare she had. She sat in hospital waiting rooms speaking to mothers who were still waiting for miracles, the kind that never came soon enough. Ethan handled the logistics, the funding, the power plays required to turn a dream into reality. The Princess Lily Foundation would fund treatments for children with cancer, especially those without financial support. It would build hospital wings filled with warmth, not just cold white walls. It would give kids memories of joy, not just pain. Because that's what Lily had taught them, that even when life is short, it should still be beautiful. One evening after another long meeting, Jessica found herself standing in front of Ethan's office window, looking out over the city. "She would have loved this," she murmured. Ethan turned from his desk, watching her. "Yeah." Jessica smiled faintly, but she would have complained that the logo should have more glitter. Ethan chuckled. "We can add glitter." Jessica turned to him then, and for the first time in weeks, her eyes weren't just filled with grief. They were filled with something else. Hope. A new future. A promise. The years passed, but Lily was never far away. Her name was etched into the walls of hospital wings, into the letters sent to families who had once believed they had no hope. The Princess Lily Foundation had saved hundreds of lives, had given sick children the fairy tales they deserved. But beyond all the hospitals, the charity galas, the doctors shaking hands in conference rooms, Lily had left something even more profound behind. She had left them, Ethan and Jessica, two people who had once been strangers, tied together only by grief. Two people who should have drifted apart when their reason for knowing each other was gone. But they didn't. Instead, they built something Lily would have loved. At first, it had been work. Meetings, foundation events, hospital visits. They were partners, connected by a mission bigger than themselves. But somewhere along the way, it became more. It was in the way Jessica learned to laugh again, in the way she caught herself turning to Ethan first when things felt overwhelming. It was in Ethan's quiet presence, the way he stayed, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He had built an empire out of money and power, but this was the first thing he had ever built out of love. One evening, after visiting one of the Foundation's newest hospitals, Ethan suggested a drive. Jessica didn't ask where they were going. She trusted him now. But when the car slowed, when the mansion's familiar silhouette came into view, her breath caught. Ethan's estate. The place where they had given Lily her fairy tale. The ballroom was still there, the soft golden lights flickering like memories trapped in glass. Jessica stepped inside, her fingers brushing against the silk ribbons still tied along the grand staircase. It looked exactly as it had that night, like a dream frozen in time. She turned to Ethan, eyes questioning. He didn't say anything at first. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Jessica's breath hitched. Ethan knelt just as he had before, but this time there was no sadness, no ticking clock, no desperate need to hold on to something that was slipping away. This time, it was just them. "Marry me," Ethan said, his voice steady, certain. Jessica felt the sting of tears, but she smiled through them. "Why now?" she whispered. Ethan held her gaze. "Because Lily asked me to take care of you." A pause. "And because I don't want to imagine my life without you." Jessica let out a soft, breathless laugh. She didn't need to think. She had known the answer for a long time. Yes. This time the wedding wasn't for a little girl's dream. It was real. The guests were small, only family, close friends, the people who had been there when their lives had fallen apart and come back together again. Jessica walked down the aisle, dressed in soft white, but not alone. On her wrist, tied in silk ribbon, was Lily's tiny silver ring, the one Ethan had given her. Jessica had kept it all these years. Now, as she reached Ethan, as she took his hands in hers, she whispered, "She's here." Ethan nodded, his grip tightening around hers. He already knew. That night, as they danced in the garden, Jessica tilted her head toward the sky. A single star shone brighter than the rest. She exhaled, her chest warm, full. Ethan followed her gaze. Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to, because in their hearts they knew. Lily was watching, and she was smiling.